This is The Creative Funding Show, a podcast for authors, YouTubers, and podcasters who want to fund the work they love without selling out.
Welcome back to The Creative Funding Show. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr., and with me today is Joanna Penn, who is an award-winning novelist, New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of thrillers under the pen name J.F. Penn, and she also writes nonfiction for authors. She's an award-winning creative, entrepreneur, podcaster, and YouTuber. Her site, thecreativepenn.com, was voted one of the top 100 sites for writers by Writer's Digest. Joanna Penn, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Thomas. It's great to be here and talk to you again.
Yeah, I love having you on the Creative Funding Show because of the different ways that we talk about for creatives to fund their art. You have done almost all of them. I think the only thing you haven't gotten into yet is merchandise. I don't think people can buy Joanna Penn.
Oh, actually, no, that's not true. I now have.
There you go.
I do have a mug and a bag that you can get on Society 6. And I got into that because I had someone on my podcast who talked about merchandising, and I was like, okay, so I need to do only print on demand because I like the digital scalability. I don't want to do stuff I have to put in boxes. So Society 6, it's good quality, sort of print on demand merch. So I've made about $6 in total out of mugs. so
that's
it's not
what the
great.
6 is for. It's for the $6 that you make on their website.
Basically, but yes, I do pretty much everything else.
Very cool. Well, that's exciting, and so you really do check all of the boxes. But I want to get started with your story and how you got into this, because you did not emerge from the chrysalis as a creator who was doing everything and doing it well. Where did you get started writing?
Sure. So I was actually, I did theology at university, and then I went into management consultancy, which is one of those random things you do in Britain, and ended up working, implementing financial systems into large corporates for about 13 years after college. And, really one of those jobs that is golden handcuffs. They paid really well, but my life was completely pointless. And I just spent my time in accounts payable departments being hated by people because I was replacing them. Basically, I know, let's outsource everything to this IT system, and here's this woman who's going to put you all out of a job. So, I got to this point where I was just miserable in my working life, even though I was being paid well, and I had a house and a mortgage and all that, a husband and everything. And I've always journaled, and I got to this point where I was like, I have to do something more with my life. What do I want to do? Couldn't work that out. So I decided to start researching how to change your career. And then I thought, I'm reading a lot of self-help books, listening to a lot of audio tapes, or sort of, were they even, I think they were CDs at that point, sort of the early days, sort of 2005, of digital media, and started, thought, I could write a book on how to change your career. And I ended up writing that book. It was called something else, and but wrote that first nonfiction book. And in the process of writing it, learned about writing, learned about the internet, learned about how to start doing sales of books and speaking and all of that. And then ended up getting into fiction. Left my job in 2011 to do it full time, and 2015 got my husband out of his job. So basically, at this point, as we talk, I've been writing professionally, as in writing for publication, for about 12 years, and have been full-time for 7 years. So yeah, I guess I'm quite far down the journey now, but I still absolutely remember being miserable in my job, just thinking, what am I doing with my life, and not knowing what was coming. And this was before the Kindle, before podcasting, before any of this. So, it really was pretty hopeless back then.
Yeah, we were scratching books on stone tablets. It was very
exactly. Oh my goodness.
So what was it like writing in the early days of the indie revolution? Because you've been independent the whole time, right? You never went with a traditional publisher.
No, exactly right. And the main reason, I think, is because I'm a businesswoman. So I was working in business. I was working in accounting departments. I'm not an accountant, but I was amongst the money side of business. I was also earning a good wage. And when I looked at the possibilities for leaving my day job to become a writer, it was actually impossible at that point. I could not see how I could make a 6-figure income as a writer, just writing books. You would have to hit some kind of lottery, or the other thing I learned is that you could do it by being a speaker. So that was actually my first, what I did first. I went to Professional Speakers Association. I learned how to speak professionally and started charging for my speaking. And all the speakers that were in that community, and I was in Australia at that point, they all learned from the Americans. So it was a very American dominated niche, the speakers niche. And I learned brilliantly, I think, because British people are quite different. I learned that I needed to start charging early. And this is something that's very important, and why I think it's great that you're talking about this on your show. Being an author, it's not just about making money from book sales. So I started making my first money as a speaker, and I had a book to sell, but I never even, I think I sent one query letter and then didn't hear back and was just like, okay, that's random. Why can't I just print it myself and sell it myself? And I just went ahead with that. So it was very much a business decision, and it still is. It still is a business decision. So that's kind of how I got started.
And that's really smart, because in fiction, especially traditional fiction, there's not a lot of middle class. You have people who are making basically no money, and then you have people who are making millions of dollars, right? J.K. Rowling, wealthier than the Queen, supposedly, right? Because she sold 1 million Harry Potter books. But there's not a lot of middle class. Whereas in speaking and writing business books, there's more of a middle class. So it's easier to get started and actually bring in some income, and it's less of a lottery. It's less of a big, statistical anomaly.
Yeah, I think the difference is as well, though, is your mindset around intellectual property rights. So the issue with speaking is that you are paid for your time, and therefore it's exactly like a day job. And I realized this very early on, that creating intellectual property rights, and a book is intellectual property rights, you can then license that over and over again. So while you will get spike income from speaking, a book can make you, maybe each copy sells a lot less than one speaking gig, but you can sell that potentially for the rest of your life and 70 years after you die. So the mid-list, and there are a group of authors called the mid-list, and I would be one of those. The mid-list authors in the world. So I have 27 books right now, 18 of which are fiction. And I make a multi 6-figure income. I make 6 figures from my book sales. That is a kind of mid-list type living for a writer. And there are quite a few writers in that area. But as you say, many authors, and in fact painters, illustrators, name an artist. Most artists are not making a lot of money or even a living wage from their art. I think the difference is this attitude of business, and also understanding intellectual property rights and being paid for licensing your assets as opposed to being paid for your time.
That's right, because it's in a sense, it's kind of like you're going through the whole arc of civilization. So at the beginning, we were hunter-gatherers, right? We'd hunt and you'd find a woolly mammoth and everyone would eat for a month, but then you'd have nothing after that. And that's kind of like what speaking is, whereas writing and creating intellectual property is more like farming, where you get this slow, consistent source of food that's not nearly as exciting, but it's ultimately what's going to sustain a civilization in the long run.
That's exactly right. And in fact, that's I think also the difference between traditional publishing and indie publishing. And when I say indie publishing, I mean independent. I'm an independent author, but I pay professionals, cover designers, editors. I do a professional job of independent publishing. I don't do it all myself, which is why I don't like self-publishing. But with traditional publishing, generally you will get an advance. So you'll get a spike income that will come in, and then that will be split into payments depending on when you sign the contract, when you hand in the manuscript, when they publish it. And then if you get royalties, they will be maybe every 6 months, and who knows for how long, depending on if you earn out. So you might get more money, you might hit that lottery, you might get, a big payment, and then it might disappear because they're on to the next author. With publishing as an indie, what's happened is my income, as you say, is quite boring, but it's stepped up pretty much every month. So since I first put my first book on Kindle back in sort of 2008, 2009, my income has stepped up pretty much every month consistently. And I've never had a breakout. I'm not famous, but I'm making a good living as a writer, and with all the other things we'll talk about. But just with the books alone, it's a case of that consistent drip, drip, drip from multiple streams of income every month. And that is exciting in that it funds my life.
Having food on the table is exciting.
Exactly. But it's not like, oh, sexy 7-figure deal. You know, it's not sexy money, but it's like living money, which to me is pretty sexy. So, you know.
That's right. And that is ultimately what's more sustainable.
Yes, and also you can't, when you don't know when that money's coming in, how can you do a cash flow forecast? How can you say, yes, I know I can pay my mortgage next month, when you don't know when that money comes in? Whereas what I love about what you're doing here, talking about Patreon, talking about recurring revenue, actually self-publishing or independently publishing is like a salary. I essentially get a salary from, well, it's not a salary, but I get an amount of money every month from, that is pretty predictable, and I know what it's going to be 60 days in advance. So I can do a cash flow forecast. And that to me is, you have to have that to make a living.
It's so important. Now, I know some of you listening, as soon as you heard the phrase cash flow forecast, you tuned out. You're like, oh, that's business stuff. I just want to do art. And I think that dichotomy is really unhealthy, because what enables you to do art and to have that emotional room to really create your best work is not having to worry about money so much, right? If you're like panicked or like, oh, this has to be a hit to cover all of my debts that are accruing, that amount of pressure actually, I think, constrains your creativity in some ways. And so it's not about art and business being at war with each other. It's about them being on a team together. If you're crafting your life in the right way and thinking about your art as a business of creating art, I think it really should go hand in hand, like what you're doing.
Yes, and I do hope that the listeners to the Creative Funding Show, and I know this will go out on the other show as well, but this is about the money side. And to me, business is one of the most creative things that we do. And, most of what we see in the world is created through people doing business. And that to me is exciting. You can create jobs. You can, like I work with, at the moment, I work with about 13 different contractors. Not only do I pay, my husband's tax and my tax with our company, we're also paying money to a whole load of freelancers. We've got our own self-sustaining little industry. The money comes in and the money goes out, and that's the way cash flow should work. It comes in, it goes out, you're building your assets, you're living, you're loving your life. I mean, to me, that entrepreneurs turn ideas in their head into value in the world, whether that's value for someone else or value for them. And that's what we do as writers or as any kind of artists. You're turning what's in your head into value in the world. And if that's not entrepreneurial or business, I don't know what is.
And that's really exciting, because you're making the world a better place. You're making the people who read your writings happy and entertained, and that's a good thing. You're providing for yourself, which is a good thing, and you're creating jobs, which is a good thing. And you're doing it in a sustainable way. This is what I love so much about business. The media portrays businesses like it's the evil, exploitative people. It's like, no, these are people who are making the world a better place, because no one's going to give you their money unless you're able to convince them that you're making their life better in some way to be worth giving you their money, right? That's the difference between being a thief and being a business person.
I think it's much better to be putting money back into the system, to be paying, like, you will, as you earn more, you will pay more tax. And I'm like, yay, let's pay more tax and fund all the things we want. I'm very happy with the situation I'm in. And I think it's very important to talk about money. And one of the issues with creatives and money is, as you say, there is this kind of dichotomy. People think that if they are making money, they've kind of, in inverted commas, sold out. And I was talking to a musician, and he was like, well, selling out is what you want to do. Like, you want to have a sold out concert. Like, you want people to be, at the door kind of. But I think it's very important to say, like, I write the books I want to write. I've never compromised on that. So I very much do the things that I care about. If I wanted to just do stuff for money, I would have stayed in the day job. But I love what I write. I really enjoy what I do. And also I love the lifestyle I have. And one of the things when I left my day job is I said to myself, well, what is my ideal life? And my ideal life was writing, reading, and traveling. And that's what I do. That's pretty much what I do. And helping other people as well. I help a lot of people.
There you go. It's a good gig if you can get it. And I want to talk a little bit about how you've crafted that life, because your money isn't just coming from royalties. It's not like you are waiting and your only money comes from that Amazon, payment. Why is it important for authors and for creators to have multiple sources of income?
Okay, so, for me, everything stems to 2008. I'm sure listeners can remember the global financial crisis. Dun, dun, dun. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, so basically, I went to work, as many of us did. It was around March, I think, 2008. And we walked in. I was on a floor, one of these awful open plan offices with about 400 other IT consultants. And, our manager walks in with a stack of paper. And basically, we're all called in one by one into an office. We're given the bit of paper which says 3 weeks notice, bye-bye. And we're all contractors, so they weren't even obliged to pay us anything. And so we were all let go, and this was many of us at one time, so finding other work was clearly going to be an issue. And I realised on that day, because I was the major wage earner in my family, I was like, holy crap, this one company has just told me to go away, and I've essentially lost my only source of income. And I declared on that day that I would never do that again. And that was part of how I got into this. And this is very interesting because you'll find a lot of entrepreneurs these days who were made by the global financial crisis. Either they were laid off, or like I was, or their life pivoted around that moment. And for me, this is why I publish wide, which means I don't just publish on Amazon. So at the moment, I'm selling books on all the big platforms, iBooks, Kobo, as well as Amazon, Nook. I'm selling on in all the bookstores, libraries. I've sold books in 86 countries. So even just I do audiobooks. Even just with books, I'm doing a lot of streams of income. But then I also, as you say, I have speaking, which is much less of a income stream now. But I have affiliate income, which means as I blog and podcast, I point to other people's products, and I will get that I absolutely love, and I will get commission on the sale. And then I have advertising and my Patreon, which we'll come to. And those are my main, advertising, sponsorship type revenue. Those are my, and courses. I do courses as well. So I teach.
So many.
I'm just trying to think, oh my goodness. But this is the thing. I'm at the point now where I'm up to, I think, around 120 different sources of income. And some of those are 50 cents a month, and some of them are thousands. So this is the thing. And that, I don't obviously focus my attention on the little ones all the time, but by building up all these streams of income, I am not dependent. If Amazon changed their rules tomorrow, I am not destroyed. And if any of them change their rules, I'm not destroyed. And that to me is how you are truly independent.
Which, in a sense, there's nothing new about this advice, right? If you go to a financial advisor, the very first thing they're going to say is you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. Don't put all of your money in, blockbuster stock, because you don't know if it's going to go up or go down. You want to diversify your assets. And yet, for so many of us, when it comes to income, it's all dependent on one person, our boss. It's like, and that one person has so much power over our lives. Whereas, the way you've structured your life, if Patreon were to shut down, or Amazon were to shut down, any one of them, or even several of them, could fail at the same time, and you're not in the soup kitchen line, you're able to, you have runway. And one of the things I imagine you're doing, and I definitely do this, is having money in savings. Part of being a freelancer, part of being an entrepreneur, is that you can't live paycheck to paycheck. You have to adjust your lifestyle down so that you're living on less than what you're making, in case there's that unevenness. And as you get a more mature income stream, that those waves, even out, but it's still good to have that foundation.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because winding back to like 2011, what happened is obviously I was working a consulting job, so I was working really hard and didn't have much bandwidth for the business. But I was blogging. I'd written, I think, 4 books by then, by getting up really early and working at the weekends and everything. And I went to 4 days a week. But then there was a moment when my husband and I said to him, look, if I need to give up my job because I have to do this next step. But what I said to him, so what we did, I mean, bless him, he's amazing. And of course, now he works in the company as well. But I said, we're going to have to sell our house. We have to downsize. We're going to start selling the car. We are pretty much moving. We moved from a 4-bedroom house to a 1-bedroom flat. And we moved to rental income, which essentially is much more fixed. So you don't have like the surprise boiler, costs or whatever. So we downsized. I had 6 months money in the bank. And I said to him, if I can't make this work in 6 months, I will go back to my day job. And of course, I never went back. But what I had done, so I left in 2011, but I started writing in 2006, started publishing and blogging, and in 2008, started podcasting 2009. So it took me 3 to 4 years doing what they now call the side hustle, which, wasn't around again when I was doing it, but doing things on the side in order to then be able to move out of my job. And then it took from 2011 to 2015 for me to return to the income that I was on before. So it really was a quite a long journey. But I always, and this is what I would say to people, just be aware of what you want. Like, what are you aiming for? What is the goal? Why are you doing this? And for me, it was always, I want to measure my life by what I create and measure my life by the people I can help. And that just kept me going through what Seth Godin calls the dip. That point where things look a bit bleak, but you need to go through that in order to move to a different career, because that's basically what this is.
I reread the dip almost annually. Every time I have a big decision or I'm like facing a life choice, I go back and reread The Dip by Seth Godin. And the most recent time I read it was just a couple of weeks ago. And
are you going through a dip?
I am. I'm starting this new podcast and, all of these new things that I'm doing and trying to decide what to prune. And one of the things that he said that jumped out at me this time I read the book was, he said, it's smart to not try something. And it's smart to start something and to work your way through the dip. But starting things over and over again where you quit in the dip is really foolish. Like, you either need to do it for real or you need to not do it. And because one of the things he talks about in that book is how important it is to quit and quit the things that aren't going to make it, prune the tree, so to speak, so that you can focus on doing one thing well. And I think that your story is a really good illustration of this, because you didn't start everything all at the same time. You didn't start the podcast and the, merchandising and the, writing for writers and the writing fiction all on the, 2006. You started one and you got it up to a good point, and then you started the next one and you're able to add and go from success to success. And I think that that's the right way to do it, instead of starting them all, getting into the dip and then quitting.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, many of this wasn't around when I started. But I think there's two answers. One is a lot of this wasn't around. So Patreon's a great example, was just not there. When I started self-publishing, there was no Kindle. There was, ebooks were downloadable PDFs from people's websites, which is just crazy. Ebooks were not mainstream. I know. Well, what's even funnier, it was 2007 was the iPhone. The iPhone came out in 2007, and also the Kindle. So those two technologies for me were the things that enabled me pretty much to move into being a full-time creative. But the other thing is that some of the things I did do at the beginning are still the engines of my business. And in fact, the main reason I make good money from affiliate marketing is because I've been blogging since 2008, and I took a course in blogging from the lovely Yarrow Starak from Umstattd Jr. And what I learned from Yarrow around SEO, so search engine optimization, and content marketing, it wasn't even called content marketing back then, but basically the emphasis was on providing value for your audience and do not try and game anything. Back in 2008, gaming SEO and gaming the Google algorithm was a thing. Everyone did that, the black hat SEO stuff. And the school I come from, the kind of copy blogger generosity value school, is write quality things that stand the test of time, and you will eventually reap the benefits of this. So while for between sort of 2008 to 2012, I was blogging about self-publishing and nobody cared. Nobody cared, seriously. And then from sort of 2012, because of the Kindle, because self-publishing went mainstream in America, my website became one of the top websites in the niche because it has really good Google rank because it's been around so long and because I have consistently done quality writing on it. So this is an interesting thing, is that my business now, my income now, is based on 10 years of content marketing, so blogging and podcasting. I'm at 9 years of podcasting right now, which is in the podcast space, as you know, is pretty old.
But, in those days, people were downloading podcasts onto iPods. I remember doing that. I had a podcast.
Well, we didn't call them podcasts, really. We call them kind of just downloadable audios, right? The word podcast wasn't even mainstream.
That's right. So speaking of podcasting, I want to talk a little bit about your podcast, because you were one of the first ones into the space. Why start a podcast for writers?
Well, again, so the guy I learned from Yarrow, he was doing a lot of downloadable audio. And I was like, I really like learning this way because I'm commuting. I was driving at the time. I was living in Australia. So my commute was maybe an hour each way in the car. So obviously listening was the way I was learning, and I was changing my mindset, which I think audio is so powerful. I also started listening to a few podcast fiction authors. So Scott Sigler being a really big one, still an amazing fiction author who still podcasts his fiction. And so I was like, wow, this is a powerful medium. And then I think Yarrow said something like, you can learn by doing this. And I realized that there was nobody at the time. There was pretty much nobody doing anything in self-publishing on audio or podcast. So I was like, okay, or they were in the speaking niche and the non-fiction niche, but definitely not in the sort of fiction niche and, that kind of thing. And many authors are quite scared of technology. So because I come from a more technical background, I thought I could do this. But, I kid you not, the first episode I did, which was in March 2009, I phoned up the lady, like on a proper phone, if people know what that is.
With a little twisty wire that goes into the wall?
Yeah, basically. But there was a speakerphone button. So I put the phone on speakerphone and then I held a recorder next to the phone. And I did an interview basically holding, and that episode is still up. Don't be ashamed of your past.
There's nowhere to go but up in terms of audio quality, if that's where you start.
Exactly. So, but amazingly, that started me off into podcasting, and I realized that you could talk to some pretty big names by doing something that they are not that comfortable with. And so, yeah, I mean, some of the people I've interviewed over the years are not, you can't hire them, you can't book them as, consulting, but they will do a podcast interview. So this is what's so interesting. So my attitude there was I wanted to learn. I was also pretty lonely, so I didn't really know any authors. So I thought maybe I could find a community if I start trying to help people. So really, I started the podcast because I wanted to learn and help people, and that is still a part of it. It was actually only 2015 that I started to make money from my podcast.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that because a lot of people who listen to the show, they're not authors, they are just podcasters. And some people are like, is it possible to make money on a podcast? How do you specifically monetize your podcast?
Okay, so basically, I'm very, very, very careful about the companies I associate with. I think in the author space, as well as many other industries, there are companies that you don't necessarily want to be involved with who will offer you money. So one thing is get your ethics right, get your headset right before you move into monetization. That I think is really important. Then what I did, I started off with corporate sponsorship, and that was based on relationships. So I I've been speaking in the author niche for years, and Kobo, who are very big in Canada and now increasingly big all over the world. They're a rival to Kindle. I had a good relationship with them, so they're my primary sponsor of the podcast. And that was literally a conversation at a conference. So that was personal relationships. And then I came up with my figure based on downloads. So that's very important. If you've just started a podcast, I don't see how you can monetize a podcast from scratch unless you can find sponsorship in that way. But basically, I had proven downloads that I could show from my, I use Amazon S3 for my hosting, and also Blueberry without, Blubrry, Blueberry is my kind of publisher, and I had downloadable, figures from them, so I could prove what the sponsor would be getting. So that was the first thing I did, and now I have also Ingram Spark, who are a print-on-demand service, and Draft2 Digital, who are again another ebook service, but all companies that I use myself and highly recommend. So I think that's really important.
And the other thing that I want to point out real quick is that these aren't just products that you use, but they're products that are specifically interesting to your specific audience. So it's not like you're sleeping on a Casper mattress and you're recommending a Casper mattress to your audience, which is fine. But Casper will never pay you as much to sponsor your show as a business that makes something specifically for authors. Because the fact that you have such a focused niche, a lot of people are like, oh, well, if I have a niche, I can't get sponsors because I won't have as many people listening to my podcast. I should talk about some TV shows. Like, yeah, but you may have fewer people, but those people are more valuable to the right kind of advertiser. Like Kobo isn't going to advertise on an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. podcast, right? There's like, for every one person who's interested in Kobo, there's 99 people who are like, what is Kobo? I have never written a book, right? But for your podcast, every single person who's going to listen to a podcast about writing and publishing is a potential customer for Kobo. And so your audience is particularly attractive to them.
Yes, and I would go so far as to say, unless you are Tim Ferriss, you need to go niche. Like, you really do. I mean, I know Tim, I think you mentioned that, I don't know Tim. I mean, I know Tim's podcast and he does have some really random stuff on there. I think he had Casper on there. But when you have that many figures, that many downloads every week, you can be sure that some of it's going to hit. But as you say, I mean, in these niches, you can get rabid fans who are looking for specific stuff, and thus having a podcast on a niche is going to enable you to make more money. I have someone who listens to my podcast who's into those sort of military figures, mini figures that they do battles and things with, and he started a Patreon, and he got really a lot of money very quickly from his very small demographic. And I think he's overtaken me, and I've been doing it like 2.5 years. And I'm like, wow, that's a really, because they're very hungry because nobody else is catering to that market. So I totally agree with you. It's a very good idea. So just back on my podcast. So I have corporate sponsors. I have a Patreon now, which is I do 2 episodes a month I charge for, and that has definitely come up now to a good level. And I also do my own marketing. So for example, I'm launching a course on how to write nonfiction in a couple of weeks, and I will take the marketing slot in the podcast, the mid-roll, and I will advertise my own products. So I'll advertise the audiobook, I'll advertise my premium course. So I'll basically use that slot, which my audience now expect, for myself. So that's kind of multiple ways to market.
And the nice thing about that is that you already have an audience that knows, likes, and trusts you, and you're getting 100% of the money because it's your own product.
Yes. With audiobooks particularly, like if there are authors listening and you haven't done audiobooks and you have a podcast, I mean, it's a captive audience for audio. I mean, all they need to do is switch over to whatever app and buy the audiobook. You can use, and if you don't know, you can use ACX, the letters acx.com, to independently publish audiobooks now. It's really incredible what we can do as independents. And I'm making, decent money with audiobooks, nonfiction particularly, every month, because I'm able to talk about that on the podcast. And I don't even narrate my audiobooks. So it's definitely a tangential thing.
Yeah, that's really good. I narrated my audiobook that I did partly because I already have all of the equipment. And it's not as easy as recording a podcast. I'll say that. It is soul crushing, but it is also very rewarding.
Which is why I hire a professional. Because I was just like, I did it once. I'd done business for authors. That is read by me. And no, I won't be doing it again. It's so hardcore.
Yeah, so I hired a college student to edit it because I'm like, I can't hear all of my mistakes. I will hate myself forever if I do this. But real quick, I want to zoom in on your Patreon because you're doing some creative things with Patreon. Walk us through your levels. What are the price points, and what rewards do people get for those rewards on your Patreon?
Well, it's so funny that you've asked me this as if I know what I'm doing, because when I started it, so what happened was I got to a point in 2015 where I had to make a decision about my podcast. So I'd been doing it since 2009. It was taking me, you know how long these things take, because you have to research the person, you have to do the recording, you have to edit it, you have to do all the show notes, blah, blah, blah. It can take 3 hours or even 4 hours to do a 1 hour show. And my shows are all like an hour long. So I was like, I have to give this up. I really was going to give up my podcast. And then someone said to me, well, either you give it up or you go for it and you fund it. And I was like, okay. And someone suggested Patreon, and this was the early days of Patreon. That I knew about anyway, I suppose. I think it has been going a while, but I hadn't heard about it. So I went on, and at the time I was doing 2 shows a month. And I was doing them quite sporadically. So I went on Patreon and I didn't have a clue what I was doing. And I thought nobody would sponsor me. I really did not expect anything. So I just went for, in terms of my levels, I was like, okay, $1 per show twice a month is like, yay, thanks so much. And then $3 per show twice a month. And because I was only doing them twice a month, you'll get, I can't remember what you get. You get like, I think you get my ebooks or something. In fact, you might even get that at the top level. Like, they're really not very well thought out. my strata. And then at $5 you get my non-fiction books and audiobooks and stuff. And then what happened was I moved my show to every Monday, regularly on every Monday. And this is another big tip. If you are going to do podcasting, it should go out on the same day, same time, at a specific period, so it becomes a habit. So if I miss my Monday morning 7 a.m. UK time slot, I get emails and tweets like, where's your podcast? Have you died? So this is the thing. I mean, the funding for me for Patreon, I never expected it to get to where it is. So it's about, I think it's about $900 US now per episode twice a month. So I'm still on twice a month, even though I do it 4 or 5 times a month. But I'm very happy with that. It's an extra $2,000 US a month. I did go and see Amanda Palmer the other night. I'm sure you know Amanda Palmer, who is one of the biggest users of Patreon, and she has over 11,000 people on her Patreon, and she's now almost using it as her whole community management system. So I was very inspired by what she's doing as a true creative artist to maybe revamp my own Patreon, or perhaps start another one for my fiction or something else. So I do think what I would say to people is they have done so much with that system in the last year. I think they've really made a lot more of it, that if you're starting now, you can do a lot more than what I've done. So definitely don't use me as a model. Pick somebody who started more recently with more of their extended functionality.
And that is, I think, a really important point, because some people are going to hear your story and they're like, 10 years, that sounds so hard. And while some things do take time, they are also benefiting from the fact that you were using really old, really hard to use tools in those early days, right? Like making money as an independent author before Kindle was a lot harder. Making money with a podcast before Patreon is a lot harder. And Patreon now is very different than what Patreon was 2 years ago in terms of what it's able to do and how many users, right? 2 years ago, no one knew what Patreon was. And when they back your campaign, that's the first time they're creating a Patreon account. Whereas now, as more and more authors get on Patreon and more readers are backing authors on Patreon, now it's not, I have to create a Patreon account. It's, I just add another author to my account. And it gets easier every month and when it comes to attracting patrons.
Yes. And I think what's exciting about this world we live in is that people are more and more excited about supporting independence. So as being now, I'm a supporter of Amanda Palmer, I get her her emails and what she's up to, and I get her songs before they go live to everyone else. And with my Patreon, I do a private Q&A every month. So I actually just recorded that yesterday. So my patrons get an extra 45-minute audio every month, and they can ask their questions. So they sort of get access. And I don't do consulting anymore. I barely do speaking. So it's an access thing that I'm giving. And it's fascinating to kind of see how these things have moved on, but that it's much more normal now to support a creative directly. Like, people would rather shop on not on the high street or Etsy than they would going into the mall. And in fact, that's why we're seeing the death of the high street and the death of the malls. People are interested in the creator and the story behind the creator. And that's, I think, as a tangential point, your story is very important. So whenever you do something like this, if you do a podcast, if you do a YouTube channel, whatever, make sure that you are the one who is heard over time, and make sure you have a slot where you talk about yourself so that people get to know you. And because that's the secret with this stuff, they have to care about you. And the only way that people can care about you is if you are a little bit vulnerable and you share your difficult times, and people will support you if you're honest about it, and you give value. Very importantly, give a lot of value.
And I think that's so key. And your Q&A episode is really great. So I back you on Patreon.
You're lovely.
So I get the Q&A episode, and we do a Q&A episode very much like yours on novel marketing. And it's the easiest episode we do all month because we're just answering questions. And if we don't know the answer, sometimes we'll just say, I don't know. Although usually we know the answer, and it's very easy in terms of preparation. So we're not scheduling with a guest and doing all of this research to create it. And yet, I feel like it's one of the most valuable pieces of content that we put out all month, because we are answering specific people's specific questions. And so when you become a patron of Joanna Penn, or you become a patron of Novel Marketing, suddenly you get to pick their brain. And the $1 a month that they pay, because you give it to everyone, even at the $1 level a month. We have it just for the $5 level. But, that's a cup of coffee, right? Somebody wants to buy you a cup of coffee and pick your brain. That's like the entry level. And if you're a consultant, it's a cup of coffee plus $300, right? Whereas with Patreon, they get that access, and hearing the questions that other patrons are asking is educational, and it's good to hear those answers. And then the other benefit for you is that it keeps you from getting into the ivory tower. So I see this happen with experts where they start off and they're super helpful. Let's say somebody's teaching podcasting. At the beginning, it's like, what microphone to buy? But after a while, they get bored with that basic content, and their information gets more and more advanced until suddenly they're no longer understandable to somebody just getting started. And they start losing their people because they get all the the questions answered, and then they're not getting beginners because they are out of touch, and suddenly they're finding their revenue shrinking. And having that where anyone who's a patron can ask you a question reminds you, it's like, oh, that's right. Not everyone knows what KDP is. Not everyone knows what it means to go wide. And it keeps you kind of relevant for that beginner audience that's so important.
Yeah, but that does bring up another really important point, which is the name of whatever you're doing. So I have a lot of compatriots in the podcasting space who started podcasts with the word self-publishing in the title, and have all of them have fallen by the wayside of the ones that started around the time that I did. And there are new people who have come into the niche and are now using that word in their title. But what happens as the creator is that you develop and you move on, and what you learn is also important. So to me, like, one of the biggest tips is you must have a website /podcast/ whatever you're doing that will last. So don't hem yourself in too much with the title. Even though we talked about going quite niche, still don't hem yourself in too much. So I had the Creative Penn with a double N was my third blog. And the other two were very much short-lived because I ran out of stuff to write about. I ran out of anything to talk about because I didn't care anymore. But the Creative Penn, I could become a painter. I can do whatever I want with that as long as it's some kind of creative work. But it also means that I have moved on, and I have talked about this on the show, that as I move on into, the upper levels, I guess, of my own career, I can still talk about things that are relevant to people. And in fact, some of my listeners say that they have left those other shows behind because they don't cover the later things. So I think this is very important when you're planning your content and your site, is if it does take, let's say it takes a year or 2 years or 5 years to get to, let's say, 6 figures, which I think is probably likely. Sorry, everyone, but then what are you going to be excited about for the next 5 years or 10 years? Like this December, I'll be coming up to 10 years on the Creative Pen, and my content is scheduled 6 months out because I have so much I want to share. So what do you think you can be excited about over the long term? And that's so important.
That's a really great point. And I know exactly what that's like. I wrote a blog post about dating and relationships that went crazy viral. It had 1 million page views in a month, and it led to a book and a Kickstarter. And I knew that I did not want to talk about dating for 5 years or 10 years. Like, this is a topic that's like, I don't want to stay in this world because it wasn't a topic that I was that passionate about. And so I very consciously, and a lot of people are like, why aren't you pushing your book more? Why aren't you, it's such a good book, people need to, and I was like, because I don't want to be that guy. There are other people who want to, they're psychologists, and they are, they are looking for more clients, and that is their world. And I'm like, let those people do it. I'm happy to let them take it, because you really do have to have, passion's such an overused word, but you have to be motivated to go it the long way, because you're exactly right. There's no overnight successes in this business. Often when you look at somebody who looks like they went from a little bit of money to a lot of money, if you look into their story, they've been preparing for a really long time. Like YouTubers, often they'll get a shout out from some really popular YouTube channel, and suddenly their number of subscribers will explode and their revenue will explode. But there are other YouTubers where that same shout out happens and they don't explode. What's the difference? Were they putting in the time? When people go and watch the second video on their channel, is that video exciting, right? And what's the quality of the average stuff? That average quality content has to get to a certain level before you really get that big following. And it takes time to build your craft, whether it's in podcasting or writing or in video creation. And there's really no shortcuts. And I wish we had time to talk about all of the other things that you're doing, because we haven't even gotten to affiliate marketing, which you're doing really well by curating really great content. And that's a great source of content. And of course, your nonfiction is doing well on your YouTube channel. But I really appreciate you coming on, and you have such a wealth of knowledge. Maybe I'll be able to talk you into coming back. We hit these other aspects at some point in the future. But I don't want this episode to go on forever.
Oh, no, but I would say on that I think the important thing is whether you're starting a podcast or a blog or whatever, or a YouTube channel or whatever you're doing, you have to enjoy the process. Or whether you're writing books, this is very important for writing books, you have to enjoy the process and feel that the conversation is worth it. So this is, I think, the third time that you and I have chatted, right? I've been on your show a number of times, and I keep coming back because I enjoy talking to you, and I get a lot out of our conversation because I think you're a smart guy, and Jim is as well, obviously.
And this is the novel marketing podcast that she's talking about.
Yeah, and I enjoy our conversation, so I get something out of this too. I like helping other people, but I also enjoy our conversations. And so I think, and if nobody else was listening, we've still had an interesting conversation. So I think that has to be the way that you go into this. Like with writing, if no one else ever sees this, is this still worth my time? And for me, that's the only thing that will keep me going, because otherwise I might as well go back to my day job. I mean, really. So I think big message, it's not necessarily passion, but it's certainly interest. And you have to keep wanting to do this for its own sake. And the money, I can't say the money will come, but the money will likely come if you focus on both the craft and the business side and educate yourself and put yourself out there. So yeah, I think this show is great, by the way.
Thank you.
So lots of things. I've subscribed.
Yay.
It's great.
And I just want to say that that's so important. If you have destination fever, it's like, I will not be happy unless I'm a best-selling writer. And then it's like, you get there and it's like, oh, I won't be happy till I have a second bestseller to prove that it wasn't a fluke. And then, oh, I won't be happy until it's a New York Times bestseller. Oh, not until it's a movie. Not until it's a good movie. Right? There's always some milestone ahead of you. And I will say, I've worked with New York Times bestselling authors who are miserable because there's some other author they're comparing themselves to that is more successful. It's like, if you enjoy the journey, you can have that joy even when you're doing it in obscurity. And that motivation is ultimately what's going to lead to success. And what I love about that is that it applies regardless, right? Like that, it doesn't matter what you're creating. You have to be able to put in the work. Joanna, where can people find out more about you? And tell us specifically about your podcast.
Yes, sure. So come on over to The Creative Penn podcast, Penn with a double N, and find out about writing, independently publishing, book marketing, and making a living with your writing. Also, thecreativepenn.com, Penn with a double N, and you can get the free author blueprint, which is all about, as I said before, writing books. And also, if you have any questions, you're welcome to tweet me at The Creative Penn.
And we will have links to all of those in the show notes. So if you just scroll down in your podcast app on your iPhone or whatever app you're using, you don't even have to leave the app. Just scroll and you can tap those links to find Joanna in all these different places. And I really do encourage you to check out her podcast and check out what she's doing at Patreon. I know she's very humble. She's like, I don't know what I'm doing. She's doing it very well. So check it out. You can learn a lot from someone like Joanna Penn. So Joanna, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Thomas.